Scotland's new hate crime law, which comes into effect on April Fool's Day, criminalises threatening or abusive or insulting behaviour, which is intended to stir up hatred against people based on age, disability, religion, sexual orientation and transgender identity. The act has proved controversial. The head of complaints at the police watchdog says it could have a chilling effect on freedom of speech. But the bill's defenders say it is nowhere near as draconian as is being suggested, and protecting people from hate is long overdue. So joining me to discuss this, the Alba MP for Kirkcaldy, Neale Hanvey. Welcome to the show, Neale. Now, Humza Yousaf has come out and said there's been a lot of disinformation about this. People are overreacting. This bill is absolutely fine. Is he right?
No, well, I made a bit of a light-hearted comment on his claim that there's disinformation being spread about this legislation by saying he'd misspelled information. Because what's really happening is that people are spreading the truth about this legislation. And it's, nobody is saying that hate crime should be given a green light. But the way that this bill has been, or this act has been constructed, is deliberately intended to prevent freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of belief. There are certain elements that are excluded from the bill, particularly around gender critical beliefs, and most importantly, sex as a class. So women's sex-based rights are not covered by this bill. The bill is silent on the definition of sex, and therefore same-sex attraction is effectively meaningless. And it really has a chilling effect on political discourse. And I'm very concerned about it. The official line is there's nothing to see here, but actually there's a huge amount of concern about this legislation for all of the reasons that I've just covered.
Well, we've invited the SNP onto the show. They haven't got back to us yet, so fingers crossed for next week. But I would like to ask them, and so I'll just ask you instead. Can you give me an example of a crime or an incident that would be covered by this legislation that isn't already covered by existing criminal law?
Well, I mean, all of the standard hate crime offences that we would ordinarily expect, inciting racial hatred, inciting hatred against any religious minority, all of that already exists. What the Scottish Government has done is they've reinterpreted the protected characteristics within the Equality Act, and so instead of it being a gender reassignment, they called it gender identity, which is not a protected characteristic in law. And certainly in my experience over the last 5 years, there have been a number of occasions where, I've been spuriously accused of transphobia because I've spoken out in support of women's rights, or I've spoken up for LGBT rights, and because I haven't spoken about transsexuals, which is a completely separate protected characteristic, again, I've been accused of all kinds of terrible things. And what this legislation does is it emboldens those queer theory radicals, those people who are intent on promoting queer theory, and that includes the Scottish Government, to stamp down on those of us who are in touch with material reality and feel that our sex-based rights contained in the Equality Act are directly under threat because of this legislation.
Now, the police have come out and said, we're not going to target performers, we're not going to target comedians, because there was some linked materials from a police training session where they were clearly preparing for the situation where they might have to arrest a comic for offensive speech. So they're saying they're not targeting, but are they not saying that they will investigate absolutely every complaint that is made?
Well, allegedly so, but the kind of complaints that I would be interested in the police investigating are the types of assaults that have been happening on women in Scotland that have been dismissed as irrelevant. And that was, I'm thinking of one particular situation in Aberdeen where a woman was assaulted in broad daylight in full view of many bystanders, and the police just effectively ignored that. But hearty words are being pursued vigorously by the police. And it's that incongruence in the way that the law is being interpreted that really is giving everyone such a cause for concern.
And didn't they just put out a recent statement saying that they were going to reduce the number of crimes that they investigate? They're not going to bother with certain forms of vandalism or theft if they think they can't be solved. So in other words, they'll leave actual crime and they'll go after spend all this time on offensive words.
Yes, so I mean that's absolutely correct. So the police are in Scotland. The police are under enormous pressure. And I know that firsthand. I've met with local senior commanders and inspectors, and I know that they are under massive pressure. But they are now being instructed that they have to investigate these types of non-crime hate incidents. I know that that's been something that's been remedied down south because there was a rash of police activity around those types of non-crime events. But there's no such protection or prevention of those kinds of events being investigated and the individual being placed on some form of register or list, which could impact on their employment, their future employment, their general livelihood. And the most important thing is, even if there is no crime, and even if nothing comes of the charges that are brought, the process of being investigated, of having to go through a criminal trial, of having to defend yourself. There's a saying in Scotland that we've all become very, very used to, even before this came into effect, is that the process is the punishment. And that intrusion into your life, the loss of your IT equipment, confiscation, having your name plastered all over the newspapers, dragged through the media, been there myself. That's all part of the punishment that these vindictive queer theory extremists want to inflict on people. And, the wrong target is being protected by this law. There is nothing to prevent this type of extremism being stamped down upon by this legislation. And there is nowhere for women to seek protection for their sex-based rights, or indeed same-sex attracted people to be protected for their sex-based rights in this legislation. And that omission tells you everything that you need to know about the real motivation behind this legislation.
Neale Hanvey, thanks very much for joining me.
Most welcome.